Full disclaimer, I have not read the book yet, so I'm just going to host and ask Josh some questions, and he's going to respond. I think we're going to keep this pretty non-spoiler. So the idea is, if you haven't read the book, you're safe to listen to the podcast, and hopefully it'll make you excited to read the book or turn you off for reading the book and have you choose something else. So without further ado, I will go ahead and read the book reads blurb to kind of give us some context for the Poppy War. When Rin aced the Ju, the empire-wide test, to find the most talented youth to learn at the academies, it was a shock to everyone. To the test officials, who couldn't believe a war orphan from Rooster Province could pass without cheating, to Rin's guardians, who believed they'd finally be able to marry her off and further their criminal enterprise, and to Rin herself, who realized she was finally free of the servitude and despair that had made up her daily existence. That she got in Steingard, the most elite military school in Nikan, was even more surprising, but surprises aren't always good. Because being a dark-skinned peasant girl from the south is not an easy thing at Steingard. Targeted from the outset by rival classmates for her color, poverty, Rin discovers she possesses a lethal, unearthly power, an aptitude for the nearly mythical art of shamanism. Exploring the depths of her gift with the help of a seemingly insane teacher and psychoactive substance, Rin learns that gods long thought dead are very much alive, and that mastering control over those powers could mean more than just surviving school. For while the Nikara Empire is at peace, the Federation of Mugen still lurks across a narrow sea. The militarily advanced Federation occupied Nikan for decades after the First Poppy War, and only barely lost the continent in the Second. And while most of the people are complacent to go about their lives, a few are aware that a third Poppy War is just a spark away. Rin's shamanic powers may be the only way to save her people, but as she finds out more about the god that has chosen her, the vengeful phoenix, she fears that winning the war may cost her humanity, and that it may already be. So like I said, I have not read the book. Josh, give us a little bit of background on the book. I know you're kind of impressed because this is a debut publication, right?
Yeah, so this is the first book by an author that I think is going to have a wonderful career. This is a strong first entry, and it got a lot of praise. It looks like it was a finalist or nominated for several awards, including the
Nebula Award. Right?
Yeah, including the Nebula Award. It got put on several Best Books of the Year lists, including by the Washington Post, Time, The Guardian, Paste, Vulture, Bustle, and The Verge. So it's gotten a lot of very critically acclaimed attention, and a lot of it I think is deserved in a lot of ways. And I'm excited for this author. I'm excited to keep reading the series, and I think that this R.F. Kuang is going to be a great person to keep our eye on.
And give us a little more background, because you talked about, you're telling me that this is more of a speculative fiction book rather than a high fantasy or epic fantasy book that we kind of typically review. So a little bit different. Tell us about speculative fiction and how this book fits into that category.
Yeah, so several of these lists that I read classified it as more speculative fiction, meaning it's based a little bit more on reality. Now, as far as I know, they don't use actual real places or real names. However, there are a lot of parallels to events that actually happened in history. The author has said that she sees Rin's life as mirroring Mao Zedong. And so it's much more grounded in a reality that kind of mirrors our own than something like the Stormlight Archive, which is often in a different world, or even something like the Wheel of Time, which does have more basis in kind of like European culture, but it shies away from being like directly mirroring our world.
And specifically, this is Chinese history, right?
Yeah.
That those are the events that it's mirroring.
Correct. Yeah.
I think I saw in some reviews that like the rape of Nanking and some of the wars with Japan were what it was touching on, right?
Yeah, so there's a backdrop of this war coming from a thin island nation that was off the coast that comes in and they're at war, and there's I don't want to get too into spoilers, but I think we'll have to talk about a little bit. There's some war crimes that are committed that are that's pretty graphic, and that is meant to.
So when I'm hearing this, it kind of sounds like how A Song of Ice and Fire, which is the book series for Game of Thrones watchers, is mirroring the War of the Roses in European history.
Yeah, I think that this is much. She is connecting it even more closely than Game of Thrones does, or The Song of Ice and Fire. I think that it's even more tightly intertwined than that. And maybe that's because it's mirroring events that are still kind of within living memory and still have shaped Chinese culture a lot more kind of far off Game of Thrones.
Yeah, I mean, I know that it's the War of the Roses that Game of Thrones is talking about, but I couldn't really tell you any other details about that war.
Yeah, I feel like that's something where you have to that's kind of an interesting nugget to know about Game of Thrones, but like I had no idea that this was going to have an event that was meant to mirror the rape of Nanking, and then I was reading it, I was like, dang, this is referring to the rape of meant to parallel. It's something that's like, even as someone who doesn't know that much Chinese history or Chinese culture, I was reminded of it and looked it up. Yeah.
So, as someone who doesn't know too much about Chinese history, how did you find reading a fantasy book that was more grounded in those roots and culture? Because typical fantasy is obviously more of the Tolkien-esque European type fantasy setting, but this seems very different.
Yeah, so I feel like, and this can start to get into the review of it as well, is I feel like I definitely missed some things that would have made me enjoy it more had I been more aware and more grounded in Chinese culture. However, that doesn't mean that I didn't enjoy reading it, and that you shouldn't read it if you're not aware of that and knowledgeable of the history in it. So I feel like it's a kind of fine line that you have to walk between making it accessible to everyone that wants to read it, but also doing what you want to do with paying homage and respecting and referencing the culture that you want.
Yeah, I've been reading the Three Body Problem, the sci-fi series that's set primarily in China with going back to the Chinese Cultural Revolution, and I found that, I mean, I haven't read the Poppy War, but I imagine it's somewhat similar, where you get some nuggets of Chinese history, and it's refreshing to learn about maybe something that you're not as familiar with.
Yeah, and this is something I'm really happy about, the fact that we are getting exposed to more of these different culture books, like the Three Body Problem for sci-fi and this for fantasy. I'm really happy that there's more authors that are coming in that are expanding the stage a little bit in terms of what can be successful in fantasy. And while readers that aren't aware of those cultures might miss some things, and they might not enjoy it quite as much as they otherwise could, I'm very happy that this is a movement that's going on in fantasy, and I hope that it continues, and I hope that we get more of these different settings and different cultures being referenced, because I think it elevates the genre as a whole.
Another one that I'm looking forward to reading is The Rage of Dragons by Evan Winter, which I believe is an African-based fantasy. I don't know exactly what African culture it is yet. I haven't started it, but I've heard some good things about that. And again, it's just another culture that is that you can get in a fantasy setting. So that's really cool. Definitely expanding the limits of what we can read.
Perfect. So, although I might not end up rating this book as high as I might have if I had known all these things, I don't want that to be a reason why you don't read it. Just because you might not, get the perfect target audience for this book might not be you. You should still, I think, read it if it sounds like something you might be interested in, so that you can grow in your understanding of different cultures, and it's still a very enjoyable book. So, yeah.
Cool. So with that backdrop, let's start talking about a review. And before we do that, actually, let's do a content warning. So I think you're going to have some things to say here from what I've read on Goodreads reviews, but tell us about what kind of content and trigger warnings we expect in the.
Okay, so there are war crimes committed in this book. Some people classify it as grimdark. I don't know if I'd say it's quite grimdark, although there are very grimdark moments. If you have been, at war, or hearing graphic descriptions of violence, especially war crimes, is a triggering thing for you, then you might want to avoid this book. It does not shy away from very graphic descriptions of violence and of cruelty and of torture and rape and all of that. So there's a pretty strong content warning for violence, and it's not a lot of it, but when it's there, it is it's pretty intense. In terms of sex, there's not a whole lot of sex. You should be pretty good. There's some, a little bit of infatuation, but it's pretty light on that. A content category that we haven't talked a lot about before is drugs. And the title of this book is The Poppy War. It's an obvious reference to opium and also to heroin, which is also discussed in this book. And I feel like in some ways, and we'll talk more about this later on, but in some ways I feel like this is almost trying to be a young adult book at some point. And so to have drugs be a way, and this is a light spoiler as well, but be a way that the magic is accessed, I feel like is kind of dangerous in some ways, because they might be saying, oh, I'm going to go chase the dragon in a way and go out and experiment with these drugs because it sounds cool. So if that's something that you might be worried about your children reading, then worried about that.
So just curious, is it actually opium and heroin, or is there like a fantasy name for them?
No, they actually reference opium and heroin. So it's heroin is shown in a very negative light. Opium as well. The Rin's adopted family are opium smugglers, and a few of the characters are kind of almost tortured with heroin. But they're also ingest poppy seeds as a way to kind of access the magic. And so that, even poppy seeds, can get you high. And so it's kind of it's interesting. And if you are someone that has struggled with drug abuse in the past, or if you're a parent and you're worried about your kids reading descriptions of drugs, not always portrayed in a super negative light, although sometimes portrayed in a very negative light, then you might want to be wary of this book.
Yeah, using drugs to do magic doesn't sound super negative. Sounds kind of cool.
Yeah. So it's a very cool concept, but I thought we should talk about that in the content section. So
so actually having opium and heroin, that sounds more real than, for example, in Stormlight Archive, Sanderson uses fire moss, which is like a moss that you rub on your fingers and gives you a high. And that doesn't sound nearly as serious as actual real life.
Yeah, for sure. I think Sanderson throughout that arc, especially with the character whose name I'm forgetting, but he does do a good job of showing the effects of addiction. However, this is meant to is actually referencing real world drugs. So
that character is Teft, by the way.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so that's good for content. Let's go ahead and just kind of jump into our category rating system like we usually do. So we talked about the premise of the book a bit. Go ahead and give us a rating for premise.
Premise, I think, was very, very strong in the sense that it's a cool premise to have this completely different setting, not based in European roots. So that part of the premise, I give a 10 out of 10. I really enjoyed it. However, I didn't quite know if this book was going to be a book about a girl going to school or a book about a girl going to war. And so we'll talk about that more in plot and pacing. But the overall premise of here's a fantasy story based in a Chinese setting, based on Chinese culture, it was done miraculously, I think.
Okay, so then let's go ahead and go into plot since you referenced it. I've seen some reviews that kind of hint at what you were saying. Sounds like the first, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but sounds like about the first half of the book is her in a fantasy school, and then it must be some kind of tone shift where it becomes much more grimdark war type things happening.
Yeah, so the first half of this book, I was like, is this a young adult book? And I was like, there's some F words scattered throughout the book. So I'm like, it doesn't really feel like quite a young adult book, but it's kind of, it kind of felt like a young adult, or maybe meant for a sophomore in high school or something. But then after about halfway through the book, I was like, whoa, this is not a young adult book. And the plot takes a pretty dramatic shift to being a story about war, and a story about the effects of war on a country and on a person. And so I feel like the plot is kind of all over the place, and that's my kind of biggest negative aspect about this book, is that it takes some pretty big leaps from where the character is and what their motivations are, and kind of it feels like you're reading two separate books.
Okay, so it sounds like lack of cohesion between the two halves of the book. So I'm curious, why do you say it's a young adult book at the beginning? Because as I'm listening to you, just because it's a young girl in a school doesn't necessarily mean that it's young adult. For example, like I wouldn't say Name of the Wind is young adult, and I've seen the first half of the book compared to Name of the Wind. Is it because the writing is more young adult style, and does the writing style change when you say it's not young adult?
No, just even the things that she deals with is kind of geared towards what I feel like would be a more young adult audience. Like the first kind of few chapters is she's studying for this test, and then then she gets to the school and she's making friends, and then like she even gets her first period and has to deal with that. So I just feel like it's done well, but I feel like it's kind of themes that you typically find in more of like a young adult book. And sometimes those themes are dealt with in adult ways. I don't want to spoil like how she deals with getting her first period, but I feel like it is kind of things that young adults deal with, and they're treated in sometimes an adult way, but sometimes in a young adult way.
Okay, so then eventually it sounds like she's thrust in more war adult events. So do you feel like that could have been foreshadowed more and the tone could have been more consistent throughout?
I actually think that they did a good job foreshadowing it. There was always kind of this looming threat of, okay, why are they kind of preparing these kids for war? What's going on? At the beginning of the book, kind of everything set in a peaceful time. However, the other thing that kind of I struggled with was there were a lot of time jumps. Even in the first few chapters, it starts off with her wanting to study, and then it jumped forward in time. I wasn't quite sure how much time had passed, but I think it was like a couple of years that she spent studying for this test that took place in just a few chapters. And then the same thing kind of happened when she was at the school. She was kind of studying and learning all these cool things and making these friends. And then there was kind of a time jump that happened over the course of a few chapters. And so I feel like the plot wasn't quite as cohesive as I wished it were. And I think that's kind of its most negative thing about the book.
So it sounds like you're saying if instead of those time jumps, if that part was actually written out and you could see more of the growth, then the contrast between tones and events wouldn't be as stark.
Yeah, but I feel like it would have taken, almost a whole other book if you were going to really dive into each of these settings and write out this character growth that took place over these chapters that were just kind of skipped.
Okay, so it says on Goodreads it's 644 pages, so fairly large already. Perhaps she felt like she needed to cut some things out and make it more digestible.
Yeah, I feel like almost if she would have taken the first half of this book and made it, this is just my random thoughts, but if she could have made the first couple hundred pages of this book like a novella, then I think it would have won some awards. As it was, I feel like it was kind of a whole book idea that she had attached to another book idea that she had, and she kind of just mushed them together. I was publisher or editor or just her, but it's kind of what.
Okay, so hit on plot pretty hard, and I think that's appropriate because a lot of the reviews I'm seeing really reference the plot as something that they didn't like as much. Let's go on to characters.
So Rin is written very well. I really like her. I really like her character arc. I really like how her motivations are borne out. You really understand at every time what's motivating her, and those motivations change a lot. But her character is done really well. You feel attached to her. You feel upset when she's upset. You understand why she makes the decisions that she makes, even though sometimes they're not the best decisions, sometimes have devastating decisions, but you understand them. Another criticism I have is I feel like a lot of the smaller characters, the side characters, are just there as plot devices sometimes, and they aren't built out as well. They don't feel like they have their own voice. They just either sometimes feel like a caricature or feel like a way to get her from.
So, and it sounds like this is a third person with Rin as the focus, and it's not like a multiple character point of view type book.
Correct. You follow Rin the entire time, and you get to know her very well. It is written in third person, so it's not first person. The writing, it does a good job on following her and having a good voice throughout the entire book.
And I guess this is also unique is having a main young girl protagonist, right? Like we don't see that a whole lot in fantasy. In fact, we were talking as a Fantology group about trying to put together a list of our favorite fantasy characters, and we were kind of struggling to come up with some cool female characters. Seems like more recent fantasy books are adding in more female characters that are really noteworthy, but not as many, right?
Yeah, I mean, we were able to come up with just tons and tons of strong and cool and epic male protagonists, and then a handful of female, protagonists.
Yeah, white men ruining the world again.
Yeah.
But I think more recent books are doing a better job of representing both genders.
I think that this would be a good time to talk about the fact that this book does deal with several different types of discrimination. It deals with, obviously, we just talked about how she's a young woman. Most of the people that surround her are men. There's definitely sexism at play. There's racism at play. The culture kind of sees lighter skin as being more beautiful, and she has darker skin. And so there's a lot of different, and there's classism. She's from this poor neighborhood, and she's told several times that she was just let in because they have a quota or whatever. And so there's a lot of different types of issues that are brought forth that do a really good job in mirroring what we are facing in today's society.
That's always cool when fantasy books actually hit on some harder things, right? I really liked the Lightbringer series for doing that, as an example, and Sanderson does a good job in some of his series too.
Yep.
Okay, so let's go on to setting / world building. We talked about the world quite a bit. I mean, it sounds like the world is our world with magic, but tell us, maybe give us a review of how well the magic and the world that we know come together.
So, and I will just clarify, I don't believe that there's any real world places named or anything. I think it technically is different world similar to ours. But having said that, I think that the school, Syndergaard, is very well realized, and they do a really good job of kind of establishing this cool military / magic in some ways school. I think that overall the country is well realized with the tone of it and the feeling and mental pictures that it paints. However, I could never really point to where they were on a map. I feel like they jumped around a lot, and the actual setting wasn't described in a ton of detail. But I think that the tone and the way that it painted what was going on contributed to the setting. It's kind of like Gentlemen Bastards in a way. Although you never quite, the world isn't huge, but the way that it tells the story, it paints a really cool picture of the setting.
Okay, kind of like in that series how they're basically in Venice, but it's not really Venice.
Yeah, exactly.
It drives me crazy when you read a book and you don't really know where you are on a map. So when you said that, it kind of triggered me a little bit, especially after reading and watching The Witcher. Like, that series just drives me crazy because I never know where anything really is, and there's no official map, and I don't know how the places relate to each other.
So this is a side note, but just today, did you see that the Witcher Twitter account tweeted out a map with kind of showing where they went?
Oh, I saw they tweeted out an infographic with the timeline, but not a map.
Yeah, so there is a map that went along with it as well.
Okay, they heard my complaints.
They heard your complaints. Anyway, I think this is another big tangent, but I think it would be really cool if Netflix or Amazon, when it comes up, if they had a way to interact through the viewer or the video player, if you could like pause it and see where they were on the map, that would be, anyway.
I like it.
Okay, we'll get back to our review.
Okay, so let's go on to pacing.
Yeah, so pacing, on one hand, it goes back to the same issues I've been talking about these time jumps and these tone jumps and these setting jumps. And so I think that brings down the pacing a little bit. However, I was very engaged the entire book. I felt like I didn't really want to put it down. I felt like there were big events happening and there were big reveals happening, and it was engaging the entire time.
That seems to be pretty much in line with some of the Goodreads reviews that I was scrolling through. Sounds like the book goes forward with a big head of steam, and it's really hard to put down. And you read it really quickly, right? Like in a week or so?
Yeah, a little bit less than that actually. It kept me very engaged, and it was hard to put down. So
yeah, that's always a good endorsement.
Yeah.
Okay, let's go to prose.
Prose, it wasn't stand out like a Patrick Rothfuss. It was written well. There weren't a lot of things that took away from it. But I don't ever remember being blown away by the imagery that was painted or the poetry flowing off the page or anything like that. So
that's usually good enough for me, as long as the prose isn't taking away from the story. I think it's pretty rare where the prose is actively adding positive elements, but as long as it's not distracting, I think you're pretty solid with prose.
Yeah, and that's squarely where this falls, I think. So I might have been reading it so fast that I missed some things, but it didn't. There weren't a lot of things that stood out to me as being amazing when it came to prose.
Well, after reading the end of the Lycaonius trilogy, I'm looking forward to a book that does not distract me. The prose. Spoiler alert for
Spoiler alert for yeah. Okay,
yeah.
wow.
I can't get over that one, but you'll hear more about that in our next review.
Okay. What I do think that this book does a really good job of, that's kind of related to prose, is taking some very beautiful themes and a lot of really cool ideas of what it means to be human and of what it means to relate to divinity, to relate to fellow humans. It does a really good job of expressing.
That's always cool. I love it when fantasy books actually relate to real life and you can take things away from it. Like a lot of people consider fantasy to be just throwaway literature that they pleasure read, but I don't think there's any need to think of fantasy that way. I think there's a lot of value.
Yeah, this taught me a whole lot about a different culture. This got me wanting to learn more about Chinese history. It got me wanting to continue reading the series, first of all, and also read more books that are based on different cultures and that can help me relate to different.
Nice. Okay, so let's talk about depth. Sounds like we've really kind of covered this one in depth already, but any more to add there?
No, I feel like I kind of missed out on some of the depth from reading it so fast. I feel like, again, it could have gone deeper had it taken more time and maybe been split up into more books. However, I'm excited to keep reading the series, and I hope that it does go into a little bit more detail with the world that we're in.
Yeah, I've heard that the first book doesn't have a clear direction of where it's going, but once you get into the second book, that's where things kind of start to come together.
Yeah, and I don't want to give a huge spoiler for the book, but the very end, there's some very big events that happen, and I'm anxious to see how the characters deal with it. And they don't spend a whole lot of time dealing with it at the ending. There's not a whole lot of falling action. And so I hope that it's given the weight and the gravity that it deserves. And that's going to, I think, actually be what makes or breaks the series for me. So
okay, so it sounds like a bit of a cliffhanger ending. Let's talk about how epic the book was. Was that last event that you're talking about a pretty epic, cool event?
Yeah, the last climactic event was very epic. It was great. And there were several slightly more epic things that happened. And again, the stakes were just wildly different throughout the book. At the beginning, you're like, oh, I hope she is able to make friends, and there's some cool stakes that happen there in the school that she's at. But then it's like she has kind of the fate of the nations resting on her in some ways. So it's the stakes kind of go from being low to extremely high, and so the epicness kind of varies widely.
Okay, so let's give it an overall rating. When we were texting earlier, you sent me a number of 5.5 out of 10, and it sounds like there were some criticisms here, but also a lot of positive things. So do you want to revise that? Is this one of these things where if you talk about it, you like it more?
Yeah, so I think that the more I talked about it, I didn't read a whole lot of reviews before coming on here. I read more like the Wikipedia page on it and a few little light reviews on it. I think I would bump it up to like a 6 or about a 6 out of 10. But that's comparing it to amazing books like Stormlight Archive or The Wheel of Time or Lord of the Rings, or these great books that are amazing and renowned. And I think that this book, as a first entrance for an author, I think it's probably one of the best first, if not the best, first entrances by an author that I've ever read. And I feel like if the pacing would have been more in line with me, with how I like it, and these kind of jumps wouldn't have taken place, or would have been handled a little bit better, it would have been bumped up a few points on that.
So why do you think this book's rating seems to be so controversial? Like, it was the finalist for all these awards, yet you're giving it a 6 out of 10. Goodreads is an under 4, so it's like a 3.98, which is typically not great for a book. Is this one of those situations where critics are liking it and it's carried a lot by the unique nature of it's an Asian fantasy and that's not done as much, and it's a girl protagonist? Like, are some of these minority, for lack of a better word, themes kind of carrying the high reviews and renown of the book?
I mean, maybe, but I don't want to take away from how good the book is, because that might be what's going on, and people might be kind of putting these awards on it for that. But that's also because a whole lot of people can connect to this book that couldn't connect to other fantasy books. So just because I'm not the exact target audience for this book doesn't mean that it doesn't deserve those awards. Because I think a lot of, Asian people that have never seen themselves represented at all in fantasy would read this book and come to love the genre or love this book in ways that I don't. So I feel like it totally deserves this praise that it's gotten and deserves being nominated and receiving and put on these lists. But that doesn't mean that it hit everything that it needed to for me as a.
Okay, so that's a good final endorsement there. Sounds like the book was not perfect, but you said you were excited to read the next one. Are you going to be picking that up immediately?
Yeah, I unfortunately read so many books that I usually go through the library or library apps, and there is a bit of a wait time on this next book, so it might be a few weeks, but I'm excited. I'm actually kind of happy that there's a wait for me because it gives me time to digest everything that happened in this book. Otherwise, I would just be burning through the next one right now, and so I'm happy that I kind of have to sit and think and ruminate.
Imagine if there was a company that would allow you to skip those wait times and read as many books as you wanted through a convenient app, and you could just check out whatever. The catch would be that you had to listen to ads rather than just go straight through it. But let's say it's free. Sounds awesome, right?
I believe you're referencing a little project called Bookshelf, Stephen.
Yeah, Bookshelf, our parent company, which is still under development. But if you're interested in that idea, go ahead and shoot us a message and we can give you beta access. Anyway, that's a tangent. But thank you, Josh, for coming on and reviewing the book. I'm intrigued. I have not read the book, obviously, but it's on my list. I have a lot of books on my list right now, so I hope to get to them, but we'll see how we do. So thanks for listening. Go ahead and like and subscribe and do all those good things, and we will see you next time. Phantology out.